Thank you so much for joining us today. This is part of a new series that, as Andy was mentioning, this is the Navigating Parkinson series with myself, John Dean, and my partner, Josefa Domingos, a Portuguese physiotherapist. And this is the first in the series, and the topic today is diet and meal times in Parkinson's. And so what we're going to be talking about today, a little bit about the optimal diet. What is the optimal diet for Parkinson's? How do protein and getting enough water, hydration, and other factors influence your Parkinson's? We'll discuss a little bit about supplements as well as probiotics. And finally, I'll add in some mealtime recommendations because I'm a speech therapist and I can always talk about that kind of stuff as well. So first, let's get to what is the optimal diet. And before we got on the call, Andy and I were talking about this. It's one of the most common questions I think that we get whenever I've worked with nonprofits. It's something they're always looking for, and I always give them the same answer. The best diet for Parkinson's is kind of a great white whale. We don't really have enough evidence. It's limited at best, and the collection of more evidence, or at least like research evidence, is going to be limited just due to the difficulties of that kind of research. You'd need a really big sample size that would be very expensive, and there probably wouldn't be anyone paying for it. There's no big like lettuce lobby that's ready to do that for us. So I don't want to get too fixated on what's the perfect diet because each person with Parkinson's is a little bit different, but there is some guidance that we can start looking towards. And the first thing we look to is the Mediterranean diet. You know, when you look across the spectrum of different diet approaches that are out there, the Mediterranean diet probably has the strongest evidence. And for people that are already using the Mediterranean diet before the diagnosis, they find that there's a later emergence of the Parkinson's, almost 2 decades for women, almost 1 decade for men. And those that do get diagnosed, they seem to have less what we call prodromal. That means pre-diagnosis symptoms. And some of the prodromal symptoms that you may be already familiar with would be constipation or a loss of sense of smell. Those kind of things that creep up happen very insidiously over time and show up before you actually go to the doctor and get diagnosed. And so that's interesting. Obviously, this should translate into less symptom burden while you're actually living with Parkinson's. But the reality is that, again, the evidence is somewhat limited. So the basics of a Mediterranean diet include a high focus on getting rid of red meat, getting rid of sweets, and replacing that with fish and poultry and whole grains and vegetables, lots of legumes and nuts and olive oil as your primary fat source instead of butter. And so it doesn't necessarily need to be a strictly, you know, this is what they eat in this particular part of the world, but there are a lot of ways that you can add, variables to it to make it more appealing for yourself. But generally speaking, getting rid of the red meat, getting rid of the sweets, getting rid of animal sources of fat for protein or animal sources for fats is going to be where you start. And then there may be some benefits from actually taking that to a step further by implementing what we call the MIND diet. And the MIND diet combines the Mediterranean diet that we talked about before with the DASH diet, which is dietary approaches to stopping hypertension. So it's usually cutting out even more dairy, cutting out even more sweets, really upping the leafy greens and vegetables. And that's a very valuable approach for anybody, Parkinson's or not, but it's a good way to maybe attack things in a really kind of, I won't say casual way, but you don't necessarily have to be on a strict diet plan to do this. Sometimes people will ask me, what about a vegetarian diet? What about a vegan diet? Vegan meaning no animal products whatsoever, no dairy products, no eggs, no anything like that. And the reality is that there's really no association with better outcomes or even lowered risk for Parkinson's with these diets, but it can have specific benefits if you're dealing with reflux, which is pretty common in Parkinson's, or constipation, or even gastroparesis. All those kind of things may benefit from having food that has more fiber in it, and also that also is maybe just doesn't quite have the heaviness of a meat diet. That's always the issue. Meat is a very complex protein. It requires a little bit extra energy just to be able to digest properly, and that's what you're looking up. So sometimes you get to situations where people say, oh, I don't really want to follow any specific diet, so what should I do? And then when you read the research, they usually refer to this as the prudent diet. It can be kind of the control in a lot of these studies. And in that case, I kind of quote Michael Pollan, where I just say, eat food, real food, mostly plants, not too much of it, not too much food, not too many calories. You might also pick parts of your diet to address a specific issue. So if you're dealing with constipation, you're going to want to up your fiber and your hydration. And if you're dealing with low blood pressure, you might actually increase your salt a little bit after talking with your doctor. And so you can follow a prudent diet, and that really means making sure you're getting a lot of nutrient-dense foods. So foods that have a lot of fiber in them, as well as the nutrients they have. It can be valuable. This is where taking like either a puree of something or a juice version of something wouldn't be nearly as good as if you ate the actual item. And then sometimes I get into a situation where someone with Parkinson's may be missing some of their calories. They're starting to lose weight unintentionally, and that's problematic for sure. And so in that case, I would really warn you against trying to maybe get those calories from some ice cream or from some unhealthy foods. You're really going to want to have the calories coming from better quality sources of those calories, because it will be better for your body overall. It will increase your sugar load, and then obviously you get the fiber associated with it. There are cases where you might need to supplement, and in that case, take your regular good normal food and add in a supplement to it. You could add some protein powder if it doesn't interfere with your medications. You could add in some other ways to supplement things, maybe just adding extra fiber into your foods, and that'll be fine. But again, be cautious about trying to just load calories in because you're losing weight. If you're losing weight unintentionally and you haven't solved it, first call the doctor or MyChart the doctor, and then consider working with a dietitian to see if you can find better ways to increase those calorie intake. So bare minimum, if you're going to be looking at this and you're not really getting too regimental, I think obviously reducing sweets, which can be trouble for a lot of folks, not just people with Parkinson's, but getting rid of the sweets. Fried foods are really bad for a lot of reasons, including the reflux, and then anything that's highly processed. And then that's kind of, no-brainer kind of thinking. We all know that. But when you're picking what you're going to eat, see if you can make a conscious decision to move towards the whole grain foods and the vegetables. Avoiding red meat and dairy. That's very valuable. I'm going to talk about some of the research on that, but I think on the one hand, those are very complex sources of protein that take energy. They're also the protein that could be most likely to interfere with your Cinemet if that's an issue for you. And it's the kind of things where you really, if you can get more of it out of your diet, you're going to have better health cardiovascularly and for other factors. And then finally, adding enough fiber, and alongside of that, enough hydration. And I think hydration is an issue for a lot of folks. Those are the three kind of key components of a basic healthy diet. Now, looking specifically to the sweets, this is from a survey that Lori Mishley's been doing for quite a number of years, and she published on it several years back. And what she found is that individuals that had higher amounts of sugar had higher symptom severity, what she called symptom burden. So it could be a higher risk of getting Parkinson's beforehand, but it's also after you have Parkinson's, you have higher issues related to it, just because the sugar is a source of inflammation and it doesn't provide good quality calories. And so as a result, it really puts you at a disadvantage. So this study had about 1,077 people. So it was a large group of people that she was looking at, and she's continuing to collect this data. It's an ongoing thing. I believe she even has an app for it. So I'm going to keep watching this space. Excess sugar, when people took it, computer stay in a second here, hold on. There you go, yeah. When people reported issues with it, they had chronic pain, joint pain particularly, changes in their cognition, and again, it's a source of inflammation, so that makes sense. Depression is common, and again, it's already common for Parkinson's. And then finally, often people who were dealing with too much sugar intake also had an impulse control disorder coming alongside of that. And that ICD, as we call that, the impulse control disorder, it's also something to be aware of in Parkinson's, and it can be exacerbated by medication. So sometimes if you're finding yourself maybe compulsively eating the sweets, maybe it's time to talk to the doctor, because maybe there's something that they can help tweak in order to make that less likely. And this is why you can't come up with a one-size-fits-all solution. It's going to be each person looking at individual factors that are involved in what's causing the problem for them, so that they can address it in an individual way. But I'm still giving you kind of a guideline from the top. I do want to talk about GERD, because GERD, or gastroesophageal reflux disorder, it's much more common in Parkinson's, particularly in the later stages, mid and later stages. And it has so many downstream issues. It's one of these things where it has a hand in a lot of other problems. You know, people with Parkinson's already have sleep issues, but having GERD can exacerbate that. If you have acid from your stomach coming into your lower esophageal tract there, it can actually irritate that and refer the irritation and make you cough in the middle of the night. If you're really unlucky, your GERD might actually go all the way up and get into the vocal fold area. That's called LPR, or laryngopharyngeal reflux. And it's a situation where you can be lying flat and the acid will go all the way up until it gets into the laryngeal vestibule, and it'll actually affect your vocal folds, which affects your voice. So again, voice is a common problem in Parkinson's. Sleep issues are a common problem in Parkinson's. And the GERD either exacerbates or could be causing that at some level, and so addressing it is very valuable. And another problem with GERD is that over time you can get you can break down basically the defenses along the walls of the esophagus, and you can have a higher risk of cancer. So it's the kind of thing that you really want to be pretty aggressive about. So how do you really address gastroesophageal reflux? The best thing you can do, the easiest thing you can do, but in some ways the most, I won't say complex way to handle it, is addressing your diet. It's kind of like exercise is probably the best thing everyone could probably do to address their Parkinson's. It's also the one that takes the most motivation, but it's very important. Same thing I would say for the diet modifications, because you can take medications that reduce acid, but the ones that, like the Tums and the calcium-based antacids, those actually bind up your intestines a little bit, so they actually exacerbate constipation. So those aren't appropriate. The ones that are more common, the proton pump inhibitors, the PPIs, are now associated with some changes in cognition with long-term use. So you don't really want to take those long-term, although if your doctor is prescribing them, then you need to continue with that because it's the best solution. And then there are some other medications like an H2 blocker out there that are also available, but if you could be more assertive with your diet management, with your modification of the diet, then you would probably have less need for the medications. Another thing I think everyone should be considering, when they start experiencing symptoms of GERD, is what we call reflux precautions. And reflux is the mechanism that's causing the GERD. And generally, when you have that issue, we as clinicians will recommend reducing acid. So like citrus fruits, tomatoes are highly acid. Even chocolate can be pretty acid. It's a pretty big trigger for reflux. So you start reducing those foods. You also try to increase your water intake. And then alcohol obviously is verboten if you can avoid it. But of course, I don't think alcohol is that great for anybody with Parkinson's, or at least very little amounts of it. But then the one thing that I think people should consider doing is you take the head of your bed and you put a brick below it. And just by elevating it a little bit, you're letting gravity do a little bit of the work while you sleep, so it doesn't make it so likely to have acid getting into the wrong places. So those reflux precautions, you can look for those on the web as well. I've certainly just told you the basics, but you can look them up and see if there are other guidelines. but it's a really easy thing that most people can do that you won't really even notice. You won't notice that the bed's up a little bit. You might notice that you're not having as much chocolate, but again, there might be other solutions around that. Surgical interventions are pretty uncommon. I've seen them obviously, but generally speaking, we're going to go through the cycle of modifying the diet, adding the reflux precautions, possibly adding in medications. And then if it really gets severe, that's when a doctor might do something called a Nissen fundiplication, where they kind of close off. They actually wrap a little bit of the lower esophageal sphincter so that it's a little tighter and it closes a little bit better. Now, over the years, I have people asking me sometimes about diet recommendations, and I had an ENT many years ago recommend this book to me called Dropping Acid. And in previous presentations, I'd be like, oh, you just find this book, and someone told me they couldn't find it. And so when I looked on Amazon, there were quite a number of people that have released books that are very similar. So I can't speak to them. I can say that this is the book that I would recommend because I've used it for myself. And what I like about it is it's not just here's what's happening and here's the medical reasons and here's the way you treat it, but it's also a lot of recipes that are pretty easy to manage, and it gives you some pretty good insight about how to address it. So this particular one, I'm sure there are other ones out there that are good. If someone has one that they recommend, I'm happy to take the recommendation and try it out. I usually like to check them out myself and cook a couple things to make sure it all works. But the dietary approach would be exactly where I would start. Dairy products showed up as problematic in Dr. Mishley's work as well, and I think this is interesting. The theory behind it may be that there's a higher pesticide load because animals, will concentrate the pesticides, and that people who drank more milk or had consumed more dairy throughout their life seem to have a higher risk of getting Parkinson's. So we don't quite know what the connection is yet. But again, in that same study of more than 1,000 people, she identified all dairy products as being associated with a higher risk of getting Parkinson's and a higher symptom burden, a higher symptom severity after the diagnosis. And so this is something where I feel like at the bare minimum, you might start looking for some alternatives. I think there's a lot of non-dairy milk products out there, so oat milk and almond milk and even soy milk, although you got to watch the protein. And the thing is that you want to be careful, because I know that we're worried about an interaction with protein and Cinemet, and we'll get into that in a minute, but protein's a very important nutrient. We need to have a certain amount of it every day in order to stay healthy. So maybe you start looking for non-dairy sources of protein, and it could be these milks, it could be alternatives for yogurt, it could be alternatives for other products. There's even non-dairy cheeses. And I would just encourage you to be, I'd say, open-minded. Look to some of these other options. You'd be surprised at how good some things might taste, or how you might even notice that they're in there. And anything you can do to cut a little bit out of your diet, it's not all or nothing at all. It can simply be a way to cut some of that out there and reduce the risk and maybe improve your symptoms a little bit. So I want to be sure that I really cover this protein interference. I'm sure if you've seen some other lectures on this topic that you've probably heard about this. This is one of these things where there's a very popular perception for sure that protein interferes with the absorption of your medication, specifically your dopamine medication, your Cinemet or carbidopa-levodopa. And that's because when the stomach opens up at the bottom here, the pyloric sphincter, and it opens up to the duodenum, that area is where the protein gets absorbed into the body, and it's also where your medications get absorbed. So if you have protein down there and then you take your meds, you're likely to have a situation where the protein gets taken up preferentially and the meds just pass through and don't get taken up by the body. And then you get either a reduced dose effect or you get a missed dose or something like that. But I want to be real clear that when they did a study of more than 1,000 individuals, the different study, they found that only about 12%, so it's 1 in 8, experienced this issue. So it's the kind of thing that you should be aware of. Certainly, the longer you have Parkinson's, it's more likely to be prominent. It might show up, and it's the kind of thing to talk about with your doctor, because there may be some solutions they can consider with the timing of your medications or the formulation. Maybe there's a controlled release formulation you can add in there. And this is all doctor stuff, so I don't want to be too far in that field because it's really not my area. But I will say, just as a general rule, when you're thinking about when you're going to time your meds, 30 minutes before meal, 2 hours after meal seems to be a good benchmark for avoiding potential interference. And it could also be, I've had some people that I've worked with where it's not just protein, but it can just be any kind of food seems to blunt the influence of the meds. And so again, just follow that same rule. I think another area, though, that I think people forget about is that hydration is also important. It makes the medications work more effectively, and it also influences the other parts of your diet. So there's a very common manifestation of what we call orthostatic hypotension or postural hypotension. And the very first thing we tell people to do to address that is to increase their water intake, because often people don't have enough water. And we know why this is in Parkinson's. It's not a mystery. It's that no one wants to get up and down and use the restroom that much. But I think the balance is the medications that you're taking will work better. The influence of the low blood pressure will be lessened if you have enough water. And if getting to the restroom is becoming difficult, that's not a reason to avoid that. That's maybe a reason to work with a physical or an occupational therapist and see if you can improve that, because that's a necessary part of life, and you shouldn't be restricting your diet to minimize that, because that's going to have downstream influences on your quality of life. So again, hydration is a big important one, and there's a couple things you can think about. Because people with Parkinson's generally take a fair amount of pills each day, I usually encourage people to take a full glass of water when they're drinking their medications. I'm not talking about like a big, huge tumbler or pint glass, just 8-ounce glass, a drinking glass, an orange juice glass, and you drink that whole glass every time you take your pills, and immediately you're going to increase your water, and you're going to do it in a way that's a little bit at a time rather than drinking, a half quart at once. That's not that valuable. Other things people do is they'll use a water bottle and they'll just try to get through a certain amount of it each day or each time of the day. So by the end of the day, I'm hoping I'm done with this all the way. And that's fine too. When you do find yourself maybe a little behind on drinking your water, just take a nice couple healthy sips. Don't sit there and start drinking it in quantity, because our body doesn't process it very well. So it's better to just take it in, like I said, 6-ounce, 8-ounce portions regularly, rather than waiting until you're so thirsty that you got to drink a whole bottle of water. So those are two important parts of that. But then, we factor in kind of the more common things that we all do all the time. We drink coffee, we drink tea, and how do those factor in? So the first thing is that there has been a long associated lower risk of Parkinson's with caffeine, and actually medications have now been made out of the active ingredient in caffeine, adenosine type 2 receptor antagonists, A2A receptor antagonists. And so that's kind of cool. That's great. But when it comes down to it, coffee is a diuretic, tea is a diuretic. And so if you're going to drink those, that's great. It might improve your alertness. It might improve your mood. There was an interesting study, a little while back, called Coffee Better for Cruise Control Than Snooze Patrol. And a researcher named Michael Schwarzschild was looking at the difference between whether coffee was going to improve your alertness, which it did a little bit, but what he found was actually it improved mobility, movement, and that's interesting. So the one thing that you got to be careful is that, if you get enough coffee in you, or you do it in the wrong part of the day, later in the day, you could have a real influence on your sleep. If you get a bunch of coffee in you, you might have real issues with irritability and anxiety, and that's not going to be very good. But the thing I would keep coming back to for you is staying on the focus of hydration, is that if you're going to drink a cup of coffee, you need to drink a cup of water to counteract that, because it will definitely dehydrate you and exacerbate the orthostatic hypotension and the other issues associated with being dehydrated. So I'm not saying no coffee. No, I wouldn't dream of it. I couldn't live that way myself. But just be sure that you're counteracting it. And even if you were doing something like maybe misbehaving and having a Coke, have a smaller glass of Coke and then have a glass of water after it, so that you're counteracting that effects, so that you, it's all moderation, right? Now, I'm making sure I don't see anything in the chat here, but I think we're probably good. I'm going to go into supplements. Again, if we get to the end and you have questions, I guess we can talk about there. But with supplements, it's a common area where I see people wanting to either substitute a medication they're taking. They want to substitute their Cinemet for mucunapurians, or they want to maybe even do a very high dosage of a certain vitamin. A common one's been vitamin B1. And I'll say that right now, right off the bat, there doesn't seem to be a lot of evidence for a high dose of anything. If you're taking it, you could actually cause other issues. You could have issues with the way it's processed in your liver or your kidneys. So it's always going to be a situation where you're going to talk about it with your doctor first. And then one other issue when you're dealing with different supplements is maintaining a supply that has the same purity and potency each time. And I think that's really difficult. I mean, obviously you're going to want to have certain amount of that in your pills. You need to get a good quality, but then you have to worry about it being the same each batch, each time you purchase it. Now, there's a couple in here that are interesting, because there could be items that are not well indicated for Parkinson's, such as manganese would be one. If you had manganese in there, that wouldn't be very good for Parkinson's. Iron would be one that wouldn't be a great one for Parkinson's, because it would influence the medications. And then sometimes people will supplement and combine other supplements with it, and that's a little dangerous, because you don't know if one item might have a component that will exacerbate. So like a common one would be like a white willow bark, which people would take as an anti-inflammatory. Well, that's pretty much aspirin. So if you're taking any other blood thinning, or you're doing fish oil, which has some blood thinning, and you have that white willow bark and you're combining those, that synergistic effect could be risky. It could make you at risk for more bruising if you happen to hit yourself, or if you happen to have a fall, it could make you more likely to have an internal bleed. So that's, again, you want to be careful about how you do this. You definitely want to talk about it with your doctor. It's not the kind of thing that I would consider keeping from them. It's kind of the way, we're not going to get into medical marijuana, but same way I feel about this with your doctor. If you're going to use that, and I'm not going to get into the pros and cons of it, make sure the doctor knows, because it will influence the way you approach treating your Parkinson's. Now, just because we were talking about mucunapurians, and I don't know if everyone's heard of this, it's made from velvet beans, and basically it's a natural plant-based formulation of the levodopa portion of your carbidopa-levodopa. So if you take Cinemet or generic, it's the L-dopa portion of it. And it's natural in that it's made from a plant. But this was a study from a couple of years ago where they went through a bunch of samples of the mucunapurians, and they were checking out the potency, and some items had almost none. I'm just going to pull my notes. It says as low as 2 milligrams. You know, when you take a Cinemet, that's 100 milligrams, and as high as 241 milligrams. So that could be quite a bit of variance, especially if you're just taking the regular old 25-100 Cinemet, and then you take Mucuna and it's got 241 milligrams. You've taken more than double the dose, and so it can be really highly variable. So you want to be careful with that. I think another thing that's interesting about the mucunapurians is that you don't have the carbidopa part of that, and the carbidopa keeps the levodopa from breaking down in your body, so that you have more of it ready for your brain. So it has to It has to pass through your body, and it has to pass through the blood-brain barrier. And then once it's inside the brain, the L-DOPA gets converted to dopamine where it can be used. You can't just take dopamine because it's too big of a molecule, and it never passes through the blood-brain barrier. And so this mucinopurines doesn't have that dopa decarboxylase inhibitor, doesn't have that carbidopa, and that means that you're likely to have more side effects that would be common with the kind of medications we were giving to people in the 60s. So I do see someone in the chat here. Let me see if I can check it real quick. Oh, I've heard off and on about significant benefits of high-dose CoQ10, coenzyme Q10. And it's interesting. I remember CoQ10 is the velvet beads are, okay, I'm going to come to Linda in a minute here, but the CoQ10, initially, there was a very well done study, and they used a special formulation, Vitaline formulation that the FDA had approved. And what they found were some confounding results because at 800 milligrams, they showed a certain amount of benefit of CoQ10. And then at 1,200 milligrams, they found no benefits of it. And then at 2,400 milligrams, this was a 3-arm study that they were doing. At the highest dose, 3 times the lowest dose, they found some benefits of CoQ10, but not as much as at 800. And they're like, well, this seems kind of weird. It seems like you either don't see benefits or you see more with more doses, but seeing the best with the least dose and nothing with the middle dose and an okay amount with the highest dose, it was really confounding. Now, they've done that research again in the future. That's old study. Those are from the 80s and 90s, but they've done it. And so there has been some benefits, but I don't think there's any agreement that the high doses that they were using in the study seems to show much benefit. I think coenzyme Q10 does show some cardiac benefits, but you're talking about 50 or 100 milligrams. I'd say as a general rule, super doses of anything don't make much sense medically. You know, I know that there's a lot of interest in vitamin B1 at very high doses. There doesn't seem to be good evidence to support that. And again, if you think about the human body, it's not very likely that anything's missing so much that we need to take 12,000% of our daily recommended allowance to get there. I think that's usually kind of a red flag for something's not making sense. It's the same way I kind of feel about a keto diet, although the protein in a keto diet also makes it difficult. But it's like all that meat, besides the cardiovascular and stroke risk that you're talking about and the heart disease risk, it makes me suspicious. So just to close the loop on CoQ10, because I got another question right below it, I don't think it's worth taking at high doses. You can certainly add a supplement in there, 50 to 100 milligrams, after talking about it with your doctor. Doesn't hurt you, but the 1,200 or the 800 or 2,400 milligrams. I don't want to get off on a rant here about this, but back in the day, that Vitaline was FDA approved, so it was a really good formulation of this, and that drove the cost of it up to being several $100s a month for a single supplement, which was disappointing. So then people were moving towards other ways to get CoQ10. There were ways to make it, but they were using chemical processes, including hexane, and that's a terrible idea. Hexane, it can be a source of chemical contamination, and you're going to take super high doses. It just seems like a real lose-lose situation, so you save some money. So again, I would just say that I think the evidence on CoQ10 is not there. Someone's asking about the velvet beans are bad, and no, I don't want to say that the mucinopurines, the velvet beans, are bad at all. In fact, in some parts of the world where they can't get medications, they actually grow their own mucinopurines, and they eat it that way. The thing you have to be careful with is how potent is what you're getting, how consistently potent is it. These are hard for you to figure out on your own unless you have the ability to do, spectrometry in your house. But someday there'll be an app for that, I guess. But for now, that's the thing you have to be concerned about. So if you have a source that seems like it's working, stay with that source and keep monitoring and making sure that the quality changes aren't present. And then the other side of it is, again, you're not getting that first part of the medication, the carbidopa, you're not getting that dopa decarboxylase inhibitor, which I won't say that word again. It's called a DDI. And in the United States, it's carbidopa, and in Europe and Canada, it's benserazide. And that was an innovation for L-Dopa. So if you've ever seen the movie Awakenings, the movie that had Robert De Niro, someone who had gotten the Parkinsonism from a slow virus, and it was Oliver Sacks who had come up with this idea of using it in his clinic there in the Bronx there. And that was L-Dopa, and he was taking very high doses, and very high doses of L-Dopa cause lots of side effects, causes psychological side effects, causes all kinds of the choreic movements, the dyskinesias. And so eventually, not too much later, we figured out that you can put in a medication alongside of it. So what you're taking in your Cinemed is a combination pill of carbidopa plus levodopa, and that carbidopa keeps it from breaking down, so you can take a lower dose of the levodopa and more of it gets to your brain and gives you benefits. So that's Cinemed. Before, everyone was taking L-Dopa, levodopa, and when you take nicunapurians, you're taking L-Dopa. Basically, you're taking a step back. You could probably, with your doctor, work out to take a separate dose of it, but again, I really want you to be sure you're getting a full dose in every time you took your mucuna before you really went down that road. So I know I've gotten a little bit off on a rant here, but I think it's important to realize that mucuna is not bad, but it's not complete, and you have to be sure you know the provenance. You have to know where it's coming from and how consistently good it is. So my takeaways, my computer's just a little slow today. There we go. My takeaways are always, with any supplement that you're taking, always talk about it with your doctor first, okay? And purchase it from a reliable resource. So if you have a store that you can go to and you can have conversations with people, that's great. If not, then you can look at brands that you trust online. I'm pretty cautious about reviews anymore. I think it's too easy to really get fake reviews on demand wherever you want. And then when you're looking at your supplements, anything that's claiming to cure things, anything that's like what your doctor doesn't want you to know, that's a terrible thing to read on a label. That tells me, okay, somebody thinks that there's a cabal of physicians who are all like, hey, we're not going to tell anybody, but we actually have a cure for this, or we know this. That's not true. Any doctor that works in Parkinson's that had any inkling of how to cure it would be calling it out to the mountains and heralding it to the world. And then one other thing I'm going to talk about this, and we're going to get to this with probiotics too, is a lot of times if you're paying more for a premium version of a supplement, they talk about proprietary blends, and it's like usually the supplements that you're trying to incorporate, like vitamin D supplementation seems pretty good, and acetylcysteine would probably have some benefits. Other B vitamins, B6, B12, in lower doses, not super doses, might be good, okay? So you don't really need a proprietary blend. You probably should just be commonly available. So somebody that's got some special blend, that's like, this is our blend, it's the only thing that works, that's a specious claim. And I would just point everybody, if anybody hasn't checked out Benzie Kluger, the former head of the movement disorders program at the University of Colorado, one of my favorite neurologists. He has a website of benziekluger.com where he talks about medical nonsense. He uses a different word, but he's great, has great insights. He has great ideas about how to parse bad claims, whether it's probiotics or supplements or other medical nonsense. So check it out. Benzie, I'm sure you've had him before at PAR. If you haven't seen him sometime, he's a great doctor to listen to. Okay, I'm going to go into probiotics because I think this is an area that I'm actually fairly interested in, and I'm kind of excited about it. I'll first say that probiotics are probably better delivered in food. So if you can get naturally real fermented foods, so that means a real pickle, kind of like the old school pickle that was in, at the meat market, and it would be in a big jar there, and it's fermented, so it's got the actual bacteria that we're looking for. Sauerkraut, kefir, kimchi, there's a lot of ways, even yogurt, as long as you don't have an issue with the protein. There's some definite benefits that seem to be showing improved motility, so reduced constipation, and that's a pretty growing area of research, and it seems to make some sense for it. those studies focus on it, taking it in short amounts, not taking it forever. So not taking these pills forever, but taking a bout of it and getting the benefits, especially if you got like a small intestinal bowel overgrowth or something like that. Now, there is some other interesting research in process, and some of it's good and some of it's bad. There's recently, I heard a lecture where they were worried that certain Enterococcus species of probiotics might actually inhibit the carbidopa. We were talking about before about the carbidopa, levodopa. Well, these probiotics, this certain strain, not all of them, may influence the carbidopa to make it less active, and therefore you run into the same problem where your medications are breaking down in your body before they get to your brain, and you have more symptoms, more side effects, and you get less benefit from the meds. And so that's something to be wary of. And again, the research is still coming on that, but it's interesting. This is another one. This is actually, the helm of this is a very famous neurologist in the UK named Ray Chowdhury. And they showed some really interesting benefits by combining multiple strains. And what they found was that the amount of time it took for people taking this is actually an over-the-counter formulation called Simproof, I believe. I think all of it's over-the-counter. They showed better on time, so your medication took less time to get on, and then they also showed better in what we call the NMSS, the non-motor symptom scale. And this is a validated scale for addressing, sleepiness and depression and fatigue and all these non-motor symptoms. And they showed benefits, particularly for depression and in sleep and fatigue, and then obviously gastrointestinal. And so what I like about this, it's an over-the-counter formulation, and again, Professor Chowdhury is one of the most famous neurologists in the world for Parkinson's. So for him to be involved in that and be publishing these kind of results makes me feel good about it, because I think there can be some real benefits from taking probiotics, or at least incorporating more fermented foods. A couple of years ago, when I was reading grants for the Davis Finney Foundation on their scientific advisory board, we actually funded another study by a researcher out of in Kansas, Mark Haub. And again, they showed some real benefits in non-motor symptoms as well. And again, with just an over-the-counter formulation, it was kind of nice. Okay. Oh, someone says I would like the name website recommendation. I'll put that into the chat near the end. Again, he's probably just a little before your time, but Benzie Kluger was trained in Colorado, did his fellowship with Michael Oken, who's who's a medical director for the Parkinson Foundation, and he came back and he was part of that clinic for many years, and then he was the head of the movement disorders program at the University of Colorado, and then he became active in palliative care and made a complete section. So he stepped down from the movement disorders clinic and made a complete section for palliative care, and I believe the University of Rochester snapped him up. But again, Benzie is always a great presenter. He never misses, and he's got a great way of looking at things. And so I'll make sure I put that into the chat so you can see it before we go. But I don't mean to fanboy on somebody, but he's a really great doctor. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about mealtime adaptations. And again, some of this is more generic, but I think it's really important because swallowing problems, issues with food, issues with coughing and stuff like that, we're not going to get into today. That comes in a couple months. We'll get into that lecture. But there are a lot of things you can do in a mealtime to make things a little easier, so you're not having to really fight so much. And the first thing I always tell people is pick your battles and pick your environments carefully. So big noisy restaurants, with lots of people around you, particularly if you got people running back and forth. I always tell people, you don't want to be in the booth that has all the kitchen staff coming, or all the servers coming out there, because they're going to be coming by all the time. They're going to distract you over and over again, or people going to the bathroom. I'm visiting my family, and I came out, and my first thing we went to a restaurant for breakfast, and it was like the cacophony of noise and the high ceilings. It made it for a much less pleasant experience than it could have been. So try to pick those environments more carefully. Obviously now we have a lot more options where we have some outdoor seating too because of COVID. That's great. I think, obviously COVID's it's not gone, but it's not having the role it used to have. And I think those outdoor environments are still there. So take advantage of that and give yourself a little more space, and it'll make it a little easier. I do think as you're picking your foods, softer foods always are easier. So you don't have to get food that you take and puree it or put it into some kind of blender or something like that. There's a lot of great stuff out there that's softer, squashes, pastas. This is a quiche. Again, protein, you got to watch that. Even with meat, instead of maybe getting a steak, you get a piece of meatloaf, has a little bit of gravy on it or something like that. That's a nice way you can enjoy the process, but it's not quite as much work. Things that have mixed consistencies too, you got to be careful, because sometimes soups can be very good, but I like pureed soups in particular. This is something Portugal does very well, is they have these excellent soups that are pureed. And it's funny when they don't puree them, it looks just like an American vegetable soup, but they make it into something that's really easy to eat, has great flavor. And again, those mixed consistencies, the solid materials with the liquids, you kind of bypass those. So those are nice. Another thing I like is condiments. And I think part of the reason that condiments are helpful is that they improve moisture and lubrication, so they make food go down a little bit easier. But because people with Parkinson's have a change in their sense of smell, sometimes the food appeal goes down. And so these condiments and these spices can actually improve that. So it's a nice way to make the food more appealing while also making it easier to eat. And, I'm kind of gone beyond. There's a whole big pile of ketchup there, but there's some other interesting ones out there as well that you can add in there, some pesto and tzatziki and other items there. Now, I mentioned this a little bit before, but scatter consistencies, anything that's going to break up when you're eating it, so popcorn and rice, so that maybe a grain of rice can go ahead of the others, because when you're chewing and you're eating, sometimes your protection, the back of your tongue, maybe gives way on one side or the other due to the Parkinson's, and so something that slips past your defenses, that's problematic. That'll cause you to choke, and it could cause some other more serious issues. So if you're going to eat those kind of things, they're better when they're served with enough sauce or something to combine them to make them all cohesive. Things that are stringy or hard to chew, like celery is a good example, asparagus, things that have those kind of strings that kind of tie the entire stalk together. Either cut them up really finely or substitute them for something that doesn't have that characteristic. It's better without it. Another thing I like to add all the time is things you can eat with your hands. I make little finger sandwiches here, but hamburgers, anything you can pick up, any kind of crudite, anything like that, crudité, it's anything like that is good, because it's just easier to deal with, and you don't have to spend so much, fine motor control holding things together. And then the last thing I like to talk about is making sure that wherever you are, whether you're outside or inside, I think it's valuable to make sure that you're optimizing the lighting. And often we get into these situations where there's not enough light, or maybe someone's backlit. When you're backlit, then all your face and everything becomes dark. And it just really has a real influence on communication ability. Not only do we really look at someone's mouth and we get a lot of cues from how to interpret what they're saying from their mouth, but if someone's backlit and there's big sources of bright light behind them, that's actually going to cause some irritation, because your body's going to have to address that bright light while it's also trying to process the area that has less light around the person's face. So those are the things I would change. And then cueing, you see me, I talk with my hands all the time, but there are ways to add cues and ways to gesture, especially in a noisy environment. And you should be developing those with your care partner or whoever you communicate with. And those can be particularly valuable when you're out at a restaurant or at a group gathering or someplace where there's a ton of noise. So again, we'll get into some more of that on the swallowing session in a couple months, but I do think it's valuable to add in some of the basics here. So I'm going to open the floor here. Does anyone have any questions? Anybody have things you can unmute? I see in the chat, but I don't see any. I think I've answered the ones in the chat. Let me real quick, again, highlight Let me highlight to everyone Benzie Kluger and his website. It's benzikluger.com, so it's really easy to remember. And again, he's a movement disorder specialist. That's a neurologist that's undergone fellowship training. They've trained directly under another expert movement disorder specialist. And so they have specialty training in Parkinson's and other movement disorders, like Huntington's and ataxias and dystonias and other stuff like that. So benzikluger.com. And again, I'm sure probably Par on their channel probably has some older ones. I know that I used to go to some lectures with Benzie. We went down to Grand Junction and we would go up to Loveland. And so I'm sure you probably have some of those on your YouTube channel. There are other great doctors. I see you have Samantha Holden coming up there. She's always great. I think that I just recommend him because he's got a good take on medical nonsense. Magnesium is an excellent, someone's asking, magnesium helped my constipation previously. Is it okay? Yeah. Magnesium is excellent for your constipation. You can get it in a dispersible format that is basically it's like an Alka-Seltzer. You put it in the cup and it just dissolves and you drink the liquid. You can take it in other formulations. It might actually also be good for your sleep. I was talking about manganese, which is a different item entirely. So the magnesium's fine. The manganese, which can be in some supplements, is actually associated with a particular kind of Parkinsonism. It's not Parkinson's. You can actually have a manganism. We used to see it in welders because when they would aerosolize the metal when they're welding, that would release an aerosolized manganese. They would inhale that and it would lead to, basically it blocks the absorption. It blocks the way that iron does. It blocks the tyrosine hydroxylase. I'm sorry, I'm a little foggy on the medical process anymore. So magnesium, very good. Manganese, and if it has significant amounts that are more than even your RDA, that's probably something you want to avoid. Again, talk about this with your doctor too, though, because they'll know. Someone talked about head of bed for reflux percussion. Yeah, there's a couple of ways you can do. You can actually have a wedge pillow that you could use, and that's actually even better for issues associated with what's called orthostatic hypotension. So that's a possibility. Or you can raise, for reflux particularly, you can just put a brick or two, or I use a couple 2x4s sometimes, and either one will work. I think for me, for my comfort, I found that the wedge kind of makes me bend at the wrong part of my back. But of course, I'm a little bit over 6 feet tall, so your mileage might vary. I wish I had a recommendation. I think if you wanted a recommendation, I would talk to your favorite OT because they know that stuff. Or you could go to a medical supply place that would have that. So the same place where you get like a walker or something like that, they probably have some opinions about that. I doubt a good bed store would have that, so I would go to places that are more medically leaning. But again, I'm hoping I'm going to be kind of a pill about this, but if you have Parkinson's, you should be developing a long-term relationship not only with your doctor and your advanced practice provider, your nurse practitioner or PA, but also you want to have a relationship with your physical therapist, an occupational therapist, and a speech therapist. So you should be able to just send an email to the OT or call them up or schedule a session if you haven't seen them for a while and get recommendations for that because they'll know that better than anybody. And along there too, I think we're figuring out the value of the social work and the psychologist in there too, so I don't want to leave them out in our team. So someone says, is it safe to take Miralax and or Metamucil every day? Okay, and so Miralax is a stimulant laxative and Metamucil is actually a fiber source. I don't believe it's actually got any stimulant materials in there. So those are kind of two different items. And I would say that if that's what you've been relying on to address your constipation, that it'd be a good idea to have a consultation with a dietitian. And let me back up for a quick second and say, if that's what your doctor's recommending, then that's the answer, especially if your doctor's a movement disorder specialist, a specialist in Parkinson's. But if not, if you've been coming up with that on your own, I think that the long-term use of a stimulant laxative in particular could could lead to some downstream problems over time, not immediately, maybe not ever, but it's not the easiest on your system to be, basically encouraging your bowels to stimulate and release. So there are other ways to increase fiber. I think dried foods, psyllium husk, just high fiber foods, and again, working with a dietitian or getting some advice in that area. Maybe PAR has some other areas in that. I think that would be valuable. The Metamucil, I don't think is problematic, although I think there are probably other ways to get that fiber. But the stimulant laxative in general, I would be more cautious with long-term, just like I'd be more cautious with long-term use of a proton pump inhibitor for GERD. It's not going to be a problem now, but the long-term data shows that if you use that day in and day out for years on end, that those people over time seem to have lower cognitive outcomes in their older age, and that's what you want to avoid. For the Miralax, it's much more about gastro. There's no cognitive parts of it, but there are other gastro effects. Anyone else have another question? All right, guys, I think I'll catch you next time. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.